So, risk. It's something that is foundational just to the way life works. It's what happens when you are responsible for your own decisions, but you cannot control the outcome because you can't control the decisions and the actions of other people around you, right? We don't know the future, so every decision that we make actually has some sort of risk involved. In fact, we make decisions all the time that bring up potentially negative outcomes. And sometimes you don't even know the risk that's involved. Like if you become a Jets fan at the age of 4, you have no idea that you have thrown your life away. I'm sorry to all you Jets fans. You can change. You can change. You had no idea. You had no idea the risk that was involved in that decision. Then there's calculated risks that we take, like purchasing a home or moving away from home or taking a new job or starting a new relationship. We all know that there's risk involved in those decisions, but we believe that the good will outweigh the potential bad that could come from that decision that we cannot control. Then there's a different kind of risk. It's the kind where if you make this decision, you will give up financial security. You will give up your reputation around your community. You will give up some relationships. And I'm not talking about the ones where you're making evil decisions to like go rob a bank. Of course you're going to reap some consequences from that. What I'm talking about is when you do something good that everyone around you might think you're a little wacky for. Most people understand the risk involved in the others. And I think we've all experienced this kind of risk. What I call this is holy risk. It's where you know in your heart that it's something good that you should be doing, but if I do that, I am putting financial security in jeopardy, I'm putting my reputation in jeopardy, and I'm putting my relationships in jeopardy. It's super difficult, and it happens at all ages of life. It happens when you're old, happens when you're young. I remember being in high school, and I was on a basketball team, and we would go to these overnight tournaments throughout the summer to try to grow as a team. We'd be in a hotel room, and it's me and 4 other guys my age, and I was the only Christian in the room. And you can imagine what a number of teenage boys are going to be doing on their own. And I remember they're watching something that really we shouldn't be watching at that time. And I have a choice right there. I can either say, hey guys, do you mind if we change the channel to something else? I really don't think this is good for us to be watching. Or I can just go along with it. Why? Because I really want them to like me. I want my friends. I don't want them to treat me poorly in front of the rest of the team. That's a holy risk moment. And every one of us has those kinds of stories from young childhood all the way to now. I know some who have contemplated, hey, I'm supposed to move. I know this would be a good idea. I know people who have opportunities to stand up for righteousness at work. People who give so generously that it actually hurts their potential for the American dream. People who reach out to reconcile relationships not knowing how that other person might use their humility and their generosity and their desire for reconciliation against them. People who forgive when it would be so much easier to retaliate. Well, one moment of holy risk that's common to humanity is how we respond to the story of the birth of Jesus Christ. Doesn't matter who you are, but when you are met with that story, to receive it means you are going to risk financial security, you will risk reputation, and you will risk relationship. No person, once you hear the story, is exempt from making that kind of a decision, because it's not like a Marvel story where you're just dreaming about the possibilities of the way the world could be. No, the way the authors tell us this story is that this really happened. And if you receive it, it's going to determine how you think about the world and how you think about your role in it. So this Advent, we're going through a series called Responding to the King. And we're going to look at 5 different stories of how people responded when they learn of the birth of Jesus Messiah. So our goal is to invite each of us to find ourselves in those responses to see, is my reaction like this? Or is this the kind of response that I want to have? And how do I move towards that kind of response? Or is this like the opposite of the way that we should respond to the story? The first response we're going to be looking at is Joseph. So if you would, please open your Bibles, if you have them, to Matthew chapter 1. We're going to be starting in verse 18, and we're going to be jumping around just a tad because we're trying to follow the narrative of Joseph. And one of the questions that I think that the author of the gospel is getting us to ask ourselves is, what response does Joseph have to all of this? Most of us have probably heard this story a number of times, if not once, many. But I'm hoping that as we revisit the story, that we might gain some fresh insight for what God might be wanting to do in us today, in this season. Maybe it's just a foundational reminder, something that you need to hold on for strength, for conviction. So, here we go. Matthew 1, starting in verse 18, says this: "Now, the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit." We're going to pause already, and you might be thinking, we literally just got started. Like, can we just finish the rest of the passage? Well, there's a lot of important information that happens right in this first verse. You see, if we're going to talk about the response that Joseph has to the story, we have to know, what is the author trying to tell us that the story actually is? What does it mean? And our English translations don't exactly lay it out in the most helpful way, but if you were to pull up the English or the Greek translation of this, the word for birth right here, it would say, "Now the genesis of Jesus Christ," the word we get Genesis from. So you see that word here in Matthew 1. This is actually the second story of the birth of Jesus in Matthew. Because you also see this happen in the very beginning of Matthew, in Matthew 1:1, where it says the genesis, or the Genesis, of Jesus Christ. And you're like, what in the world? Why does that even matter? Well, what Matthew, or the writer, is trying to do here is trying to set this on analogy to the same story of Genesis 1 and 2. Because if you were to look at the Greek translation of Genesis 1 and 2, it would say, in the beginning, or the genesis of the heavens and the earth in Genesis 1, and then in Genesis 2, again, the genesis, or the Genesis of the heavens and the earth. What Matthew is doing is he is presenting the birth of Jesus Christ as a new creation moment in the world. Genesis has two creation accounts. Matthew now has two new creation, Jesus, accounts, with a genealogy in chapter 1 and a narrative creation moment in chapter 2. That is what the birth of Jesus, Messiah, is about. It's the beginning moment of God's new creation. Just like in Genesis 1, everything started out as chaos and darkness, and the Spirit hovers over the deep and transforms the chaos waters of the deep to life-giving waters and brings about order and life and land. The author of the Gospel of Matthew is presenting Jesus as God's new moment, where his Spirit enters darkness and chaos of the world and enters a lifeless womb to bring order and life. Now, also, a word about the miraculous conception. We live in a world where science is on top. That's the thing that matters the most. It's the way we explain things. We have to be able to explain it. So we become skeptical of these kinds of things. But this is the story. This is the story that Matthew is telling us. In fact, one of the main arguments against the possibility of the virgin conception is that people say, well, there's myths like this all over the Greek world back then. They had virgin conceptions and all kinds of stories. This idea was already common, but everyone knew that they were myths. Well, here's a couple major differences between Jesus' story, the birth of Jesus, and any of those. No one actually thought that those myths were actually possibilities. They were like the Marvel stories. No one thinks that those things are possible. Jesus, this was a real news story where the author is saying, no, this is a moment where God stepped into history and actually did miraculous work. The other major difference is that divine virgin conceptions of myth all included godlike figures taking on human form, and every story includes in graphic detail what was going on in these stories. Now, Jesus' story is different. The Spirit enters Mary, hovers over her womb, bringing life from nothing. And if most people can conceive that a God would create all things from nothing, then of course he can enter into history and do the same thing as a new creation moment. But this is important here. This is the story that Joseph is responding to. And look at what happens when God enters the world in a new creation moment. It creates situations of great holy risk. Let's keep reading. You'll see what I mean. Matthew 1:19. And her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. Up to this point, Joseph knows nothing about what happened in verse 18. All he knows is that Mary is now pregnant and they have not done anything yet. Now, can we just step into Joseph's shoes for a moment? You live in a culture where engagement is almost as serious as marriage. In fact, to break off an engagement was way more serious than breaking one off today. You actually have to divorce that person. You can imagine this. You're engaged to someone who's about to have a child, and you're not the parent. How would you feel? From what you see, you would feel betrayed, broken, angry, confused, lost. What would you do? Most people in our world today would cut that person off so fast, and then they blast it all over social media about how so-and-so cheated on them so that they could save their own dignity. Now, hopefully we're already feeling some compassion for Mary in this situation because she didn't do anything to be put in that situation either. But we're not talking about Mary today. We will talk about her response in another message. Today we're focused on Joseph. All that has happened up to this point is God breaking into the world, which we as the reader see as a really good thing because we get to look at it afterwards. But what does Joseph see so far? All he sees is seeming evil, brokenness. But even in the face of all of that, the text says, being a just man, being merciful, he doesn't want to put her to shame. Even in this moment, we're already seeing Joseph as the kind of human that God can work with. And as we'll see through the rest of the story, Joseph is actually the Israel that God had been desiring throughout the entire Hebrew Bible. These are the kinds of humans that are ready when the moment of holy risk comes. Only a person who's cultivated that character and that trust in the character of God is ready when the moments of holy risk come. It's not like a light switch where you can turn it on in this moment and then turn it off. It's something that you cultivate over time. So Joseph, in an effort to protect Mary, plans to divorce her quietly. This showed he was trying to be a merciful man. He's really struggling with, what do I do in this situation? What is best for everyone? What is righteous? People probably knew that they had been betrothed, and they were looking at him. What are you going to do? What are you going to do, Joseph? In fact, in that culture, he could have emphasized his power to save his own dignity, and he could have publicly shamed her. He could have had her stoned to death. Anyways, he could have tried to ruin the rest of her life. She would have been ostracized, never had another husband. She would have been alone. Humanly speaking, in that culture, with those lenses on, that was what would make most sense. Joseph's not doing that. So, what's going to happen? Joseph's thinking, how am I going to handle this? Verse 20. But as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, latch onto that right there. Do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means, psst, psst, reader, God with us. When Joseph woke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took his wife, but he knew her not until she had given birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. In a moment of great distress, Joseph, seeking to do what was righteous and merciful, God visits him with his messenger. Now, in our scientific world, we also think of dreams. Really? God visiting him in a dream? That's not the way that we typically communicate the way that God reaches out to us. But the idea of divine intervention is an absolutely common theme throughout the Hebrew Bible, and what the author is trying to do, at least one of the things that the author is doing, is connecting Joseph to many of the key figures back throughout the entire Hebrew Bible story. Adam, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, David, Solomon, Daniel, Samuel, and others all heard from God in dreams. I've always wondered, why dreams? Because, again, we don't think of those, at least within our context, of being very significant in our world today. But if we take our cultural lenses off and we try to take the text for what it's trying to communicate, perhaps we can learn something here. All dreams are moments where humans enter some kind of new consciousness where they take off the lenses of their own perceptions of what is happening in the world and can listen to a different perspective of what reality is like. And the way Matthew talks about dreams and talks about this story helps us to see that God initiates communication through this dream if Joseph will listen. It's an opportunity for Joseph to lay down what he might think is actually happening and let God give him a new perspective. I mean, we have that opportunity all the time here in the modern day. If we will take off our lenses and admit that our perspective is so limited, and we invite God, hey, show me what's really going on here, he will do it. What does the messenger say to Joseph? Well, he meets Joseph right where he's at and how he feels about all that is going on, and he invites him to trust a different kind of reality. He's like, listen, you got these glasses on, try these on for size. He says, Joseph, don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife. She's actually carrying the baby who's going to be the Messiah, the anointed one that we've all been waiting for. God knew the state of Joseph's heart. He knew Joseph was afraid. It says, do not be afraid. God wasn't angry at Joseph. In fact, God was merciful and gracious to give him an invitation to see things how they really are and not just how they appeared to Joseph. One of the key questions that I used to ask a lot in this story and still kind of wrestle with is, why does God care so much about Joseph being involved in all of this and taking Mary as his wife? You see, as long as he's got Jesus and Mary, who else does he need? But I think the author here shows us exactly why God believed that Joseph was essential in this story. You see, all along the story, God has made promises to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Judah, to David, to Solomon, that there would be a seed through them who would end up blessing the entire world. More specifically, God promised the king of all nations to come through the line of Judah and the line of David. But you have to be imagining that for the previous hundreds of years, the line of Judah had not exactly seen anyone sit on any kind of throne like that. Joseph in chapter 1 is shown to be that promised line. But it had been so long for them to have any kind of hope. Most likely, Joseph was this common, poor carpenter, pretty different from his long-ago ancestor David, who sat on a throne, who united the tribes of Israel and was killing Goliath. No, Joseph was not experiencing that. But God was not going to bring the Messiah just from anywhere. He was going to follow his plan. He was going to be faithful to his promise no matter how unlikely it seemed. Notice what he says. Joseph, son of David. He goes right towards his identity. He says, remember who you are, Joseph. You are royalty. No, it doesn't look like it. In fact, I know some guy named Herod who's pretty wicked is actually on the throne right now. You're righteous. You're trying to do what's right. And you're the poor one. And now you're in a pretty impossible situation. But you're a son of David. Remember who you are. And just that phrase, if Joseph listens to who God says he is, can unlock confidence in Joseph to take on the holy risk that God was about to ask of him. Then God offers the new perspective on reality. And it's one that only Joseph gets to witness for now. And it's one that is going to cost him dramatically if he lives into it. He says, Joseph, try these new glasses on. Mary didn't cheat on you. I put life in her womb. Now, Joseph's been presented with the story. How's he going to respond? He doesn't say a word. Not a word. He just obeys. He knew the cost of the holy risk, and he gave it up to live into this new divine perspective. But Joseph's story doesn't even stop there. We're going to see just a little bit more of the risk that he took on. We see two more pieces of the story that helps us understand even more the role of Joseph in the story. So Matthew 2, 13 to 15. Behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph again in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose, notice, again, doesn't say a word, and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Then we finish the narrative in 19 to 23, but when Herod died, so Joseph, Mary, and Jesus are in Egypt. When Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream again in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose, again, not a word, and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, again, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. Now, obviously, there's a lot that happens in those passages, but I just want to point out a couple things to notice. Joseph could have been freed from all of this had he said, "Nah, I'm not doing this." He could have been freed from public shame. If he didn't remain faithful to what God had asked him to do. He could have avoided a trip to Egypt, being ostracized from a community, but he took on that burden because he trusted God. And what happened? Well, he becomes the new patriarch of the new Israel. He becomes the new patriarch of the new Israel. His story is set on analogy to the patriarchs and the family of Israel in the story of Genesis and Exodus. Just like Jacob and his 12 sons moved to Egypt because of famine, and they were caring for their family, Joseph cares for his family by fleeing to Egypt when others wanted to kill his son. And just like the children of Israel were led back to Israel by God to the land of Canaan, Joseph returns his family back to Israel to accomplish the installment of the kingdom God always intended to create. The major difference, though, between Joseph and the Israel of the Hebrew Bible is that he was quietly obedient. Doesn't have a major quote in the Gospels. In fact, he doesn't even utter a word. But his faith in the divine perspective of the birth of the Messiah of the world led him to take on that holy risk? His response was quiet obedience. What a response. Now, as people in the 21st century reading this story from an author of about 2,000 years ago, what in the world might this have to do with us? What is he trying to communicate to us? Well, there's some connections that I think we can make between the original readers of the story and also perhaps Joseph. In fact, these connections are not just like a one-time event. Okay, I trust that Jesus came to earth through a virgin conception, and then I'm done. No, if that's true, it's going to impact us every single day for the rest of our lives. Joseph and even the followers of Jesus who read and meditated on this story, they saw a similar world as we do. They had a similar lens that we do. Joseph and these early Christians were all met with seemingly impossible situations if they look through the glasses that the world gives us. You see, to trust the new divine message of the birth of the king threatened their livelihood, their financial security, their relationships, their reputation. To hail Jesus as the newborn king meant being ridiculed by neighbors. Some of them were thrown in prison for blaspheming the emperor. Some of them lost family relationships. We have connections like that today. Every day is a possible new day for a moment of holy risk. Whether it's working and just fibbing a bit on your tax documents so that you can save money for your future, to speaking up in a group of friends who are gossiping and saying, hey, let's not talk like this. It's not merciful. It's not just. It's not righteous. You're risking things in those moments. From working in corporate America and not participating in trash talking your boss, or maybe actually speaking up about your faith with over lunch with a coworker, you risk things. Living a generous life where you give so much that it actually hurts you a bit for the sake of the kingdom. 2, choosing a different path for life than what everyone else around you thinks you're supposed to be doing because you're trying to go where God is leading. Those are all sorts of holy risk. And each of our stories hits them at some point. Here's the deal, though. Joseph's response tells us this. Obedience in those holy risk decisions form you into a conduit for new creation. Obeying God in the holy risk moments forms you into a person who can be a conduit for new creation. The truth. Mary and Joseph, their family was rejected. It's not a glamorous story where they came back and their whole family's like, oh yeah, we believe you. We accept you back. In fact, Jesus gets mocked in one of his gospels as being the child of fornication. Joseph, Mary, and Jesus lived their whole lives with people disgracing them. To be honest, sometimes that's what holy risk just feels like. When you put the new glasses on of the true king who came, you see the world differently. And the deeper you hold on to that story and live into it, the greater the holy risk becomes. You can lose family relationships. You don't become as rich as you could be. You're willing to accept different positions in the workplace because of your humility, because of your desire for justice. And when that happens, it's like you've got a whole different lens than the people around you. They see reality way differently than you. They might respect you less, think you're crazy, withhold opportunities from you. Some will even get mad at you. But it is precisely in those holy risk moments that you open up yourself to being a conduit for new creation. I have a friend at the church that my family was a part of before we moved to Jersey. He's a really cool guy. He did all of the media production, like taking photos, videos, all of that kind of stuff. And he was really good at his job. And his wife became friends with the lead pastor of that church. And the lead pastor was a guy who had tons of influence, not only in the church, but in the community. Like he was friends with the mayor, the senator, all that kind of stuff. And he had a lot of power. no one rarely said no to this guy because he was usually the smartest person in the room, if not all the time. Well, over time, the lead pastor's wife started sharing some things that were happening at home that just were not good. And she was afraid to confront because she was afraid no one would believe her. Because all that they ever saw was this lead pastor doing his job. And to be honest, she was right. You see, when my friend learned of it, he was pretty skeptical at first. He was like, I've never seen any of this like this in the workplace. How is this going to be true? And no one had ever shared stuff like this with him before, so it didn't make sense. But then one day, he had a meeting and with the pastor, and it was right after he had spent some time with his wife listening a little bit more, and he was trying to think, okay, what am I supposed to do in this situation? He had a meeting with the pastor, and it just all clicked. And in that moment, he was like, all right, he didn't say this, but he was in a holy risk moment. If he says something, then he could lose his job. Do I not say something and just see if it all works out? My wife, if I lose my job, he has a wife who has a lot of extreme physical ailments. They'd be in a really tough spot. So they prayed over it, and they decided to take the journey of helping the pastor's wife. A couple weeks ago, he lost his job over the situation. He's been ostracized from friends. He and his wife are still walking with the pastor's wife, trying to help her. But you know what led them to make that decision? That's a big decision, but it's the same thing that helps us in small day-to-day decisions. It's the same reason Joseph took Mary as his wife. They believed the character of God. They believed that the baby boy who was born was the actual true king, and he's worth following. You see, Joseph didn't know for a fact that Jesus was going to raise from the dead. Joseph didn't know Jesus was going to do miracles. Joseph didn't know the rest of the story. All he knew up to that point was what God had told him, and he could hope for the future. My friend does not know the rest of the story. He doesn't know what's going to be the end. So how do they take the holy risk? It's because they knew that the God who brought order and life out of chaos in Genesis 1 in the first creation is the same God who brought the people out of Egypt in another new creation moment, and is now the same God calling them to trust his new creation moment in Jesus Christ to form a new people. For Joseph, God used him to bring up the king from the line of Judah to sit on the throne of David forever. For my friend, he's already getting to see new creation happening because he was willing to be a conduit. He sees husbands reaching out saying, man, I really got to work on the way that I treat my wife. Will you pray for me? Will you work with me? Women in the church experiencing hope because they hear that God does care. He is hearing me. The pastor's wife is in the best place she's ever been in 20 years. Their special needs son, who hadn't walked in 3 years, is now walking again. My friend didn't know any of that was going to be happening. But he was willing to take the holy risk in the small moments and in the big moments. So this Advent, as we're thinking about ways to respond to the King, if we receive that news, there's going to be holy risk moments for us. What's yours right now? Maybe for you, it's asking for help in your marriage or in a relationship. Maybe it's actually talking to your coworker, inviting them out to lunch. Maybe it's being generous in the way that you feel called right now, even if it looks scary. Maybe it's forgiving someone who's wronged you. Maybe it's confessing something that's been weighing on your heart and you're afraid of how people will respond. Maybe it's being bold to shut down gossip that's happening in your friend group. All of these have real costs involved. But if God really did enter the world in Jesus, then the holy risk will be worth it, even if we don't know the end of the story yet. So take a moment and just go before God and ask him, what is the holy risk for me right now? I'll give us a few seconds and then I'll pray for us.